Hey, what's up you guys? This is Steffi, aka My Humble Opinion, and today is not Wednesday, today is not Friday, but I thought I would make this video because on Saturday I saw a new documentary called Whitney, Can I Be Me? It premiered on Showtime. On Saturday, I believe the date was August 26th. I would consider myself to be a Whitney Houston fan, and after I watched the movie, I went on YouTube to kind of see what other people thought about the movie, and I didn't see too many reviews, too many videos, period, about this movie. So I thought I would make this movie review as a way to sort of like initiate conversation with other people who have also seen the documentary and just like Whitney Houston fans in general, because I think Whitney Houston's legacy and life and this documentary in general is something that's worth watching and worth talking about. So that's really why I wanted to make this video. So without further ado, this video, as you can tell from the title, is going to be a movie review about Whitney, Can I Be Me? I'm going to be talking about the pros and the cons and some things that I learned along the way, because even though I would consider myself to be a Whitney Houston fan, I personally don't know Whitney Houston like that. Like, I don't know her backstory, I don't know her life story, any of that. Like, I've never read a Whitney Houston book, I've never watched like a Whitney Houston documentary. I saw that Lifetime movie that was directed by Angela Bassett a couple years ago, and I've seen some interviews like because of YouTube, but I don't know Whitney like that. So because I don't know Whitney like that, I remember when I first found out about this documentary that it was even happening and I found out the date, I put it in my calendar because I was like, ooh, I really want to watch that because I want to learn more about Whitney. So I'm just telling you guys that because I want you guys to know like the perspective that I'm coming from. So without further ado, let's do this review.
Whitney Houston died from a broken heart. She died from a broken heart.
Alright, so I'm gonna get into some of the pros of this movie. So when I watched this trailer like a couple weeks ago, the essential like thesis statement of this documentary was that Whitney Houston died of a broken heart, which I found like to be a pretty interesting thesis, because usually when you think about Whitney Houston's death, you're like, oh, Whitney died from a drug overdose. But the fact that this documentary was setting it up that Whitney Houston died from a broken heart, it was interesting. It personally made me want to watch the documentary even more, regardless of the fact that it was Whitney Houston. So that's something that I really liked, because it wasn't pinpointing it was a drug overdose that killed Whitney. It was setting up that it was something much, much deeper than that. Another thing that I really liked about this movie is that it showed behind the scenes footage and some footage from a tour that apparently was never released before until now. It was a tour that was done in 1999. I don't know what the name of the tour is, sorry, but I like that footage was included into this documentary, because personally I think it's really cool when you get to see some behind the scenes footage of like anything, period. And in general, I think it was just like really cool to see Whitney Houston perform and do the thing that she's best known for. And another reason why I thought that footage was pretty cool too was that during the parts of the documentary where they would talk about the friction between Robin Crawford and Bobby Brown, there were very clear moments from that footage where you could see like the tension and the friction. So I was like, ooh, that was really cool to see. I also like that this documentary really spanned from when Whitney was a young person, like when she was growing up until the point where she ultimately passed away. I was born in 1993, so I didn't really get to experience the height of Whitney Houston like in the late 80s, early 90s. So for me personally, it was a treat to get to see a very young, healthy, green Whitney do her thing and win all these awards, because that was definitely not where Whitney Houston was at her career by the time I was like of a conscious age. So it was really cool to see that footage implemented in the documentary. So I thought that this was a pretty good documentary for someone who is not too knowledgeable about Whitney Houston, aka someone like me. I learned a lot about Whitney from watching this documentary. Like, for instance, I thought, like many people probably do, I thought that Bobby Brown was the person that introduced Whitney to drugs, but apparently Whitney was already on drugs long before Bobby Brown came into the picture, and I think it was her brother that introduced her to drugs, so that was something that I learned. I also did not know that supposedly, or it's suggested strongly in this documentary, that Whitney had some sort of possible relationship with her friend, Robin Crawford. I didn't even know about this aspect of Whitney Houston's life until I saw this documentary, so that was like a big shocker for me. I didn't know that her mother, Cissy Houston, put a lot of pressure on Whitney and kind of, I guess you can say, vicariously living through her daughter's career and her daughter's success. I didn't know that she strongly steered Whitney's life in a very precise direction. I also didn't know that Whitney Houston's strict religious upbringing and background also caused her a lot of personal pressure as well. I thought that was a really interesting aspect that they somewhat explored in the documentary, because again, that's just something that I didn't even know, period. And I also didn't know that her dad sued her several months before he passed, and that was really, really sad. So in general, there were just so many revelations about Whitney that I had because I just didn't know that much about her. Regardless of the positives, now I'm going to talk about some of the cons. So this is a really like small thing, but it was something that bothered me. If you watch the documentary, they had like lots of talking head moments, and when they shot the talking heads, they were kind of like in the center, and there was like this black sheet behind them, but it looked really, really like cheap and tacky, and I was like, oh, like you could have dressed up the room or dress up the setting like a little bit more. I don't know, it just looked really like cheap to me. Sorry, that was something that bothered me. Also, something that I learned in researching like more information about this movie is that this is an unauthorized documentary biography about Whitney. And if you guys didn't know, Whitney Houston's family is actually coming out with their own documentary biography version about Whitney, like I think next year. So look out for that if you're interested. But I didn't know that this was an unauthorized like documentary. And because it was unauthorized, it definitely had that vibe to me. Like some of the footage that they used, like the Oprah interview with Cissy, it wasn't of really high quality. No shade, but I feel like I could honestly download a better quality version of that interview from YouTube. There were also like key people that they just weren't able to interview because it wasn't like authorized, or just simply because those people didn't want to talk, like Cissy Houston and Bobby Brown, and also Robin Crawford was noticeably missing from this documentary. I think they did show interviews with those people, but I'm pretty sure those interviews weren't made for this movie. Another thing that I felt that was sort of like a con was that this movie left me wanting more. And I guess like in a way that could be seen as a pro too, but after I watched this movie, and maybe because I'm just like so new to like the story of Whitney Houston's life, I just was left with so many questions. And like strangely enough, even though this was a documentary about Whitney Houston, and it's an hour and 40 something minutes, even though it's about her, it was a very like distant view of Whitney. I didn't really feel like we were like intimate, like not like that, but I didn't really feel like we were intimate and in the thick of it with like Whitney and all of her stuff. I felt like we were learning a lot, but it wasn't like we were in it, if that makes any sense. Like it felt like a very distant view, like we were like very, very far away watching all of this happen, where like sometimes when I watch other documentaries, like I feel like I'm in the thick of it. One of those moments though where I did feel like we were in the thick of it was there was a scene that was used where they showed Whitney and Bobby having like lunch at this restaurant, and Bobby started getting down on Bobby Christina's weight, and he talks about how he looked at her from the side profile and she's kind of developing a chin, and Whitney Houston, like she starts getting like really upset, and she tells Bobby like, you know, don't do this, why are you doing this, don't talk about her like that. That felt like a very like emotional, like vulnerable moment, and that was like really, really difficult to see. But even though that was really difficult to see, I was like, yes, this is like good, like I want more of this. I didn't have enough of those moments in this documentary, but overall I was just left with more questions left unanswered. So I guess after watching this documentary, I'm gonna have to do a lot of my own personal research about Whitney and her life. And I guess the biggest con for me after watching this documentary is that it just felt like such a downer, man. Like we all know how it ended for Whitney, but throughout this documentary, there was never really like a high point at all. Like it was just like Whitney was going through this, and then Whitney was going through that, and this. And it's like, even though in any story or in any documentary, there's always sort of like this high point, or at least it will like end on some sort of reflective, like celebratory high note, despite the person you're doing this documentary about, or despite the outcome of the movie being like bad. There's always some sort of celebration of like life or something. And I felt like this movie was just honestly such a downer. I know this is like a completely different documentary, but I'm gonna reference Michael Jackson's Bad 25 documentary that was directed by Spike Lee. Now, when I watched that documentary, it's totally different because like this one was about like Whitney Houston's personal life, whereas that documentary is about Michael Jackson's creative process during Bad. But Michael Jackson passed away too, and they touched on that in the documentary. But when that documentary ended, it was such like a celebration of Michael's life and Michael's legacy and that album. But when this documentary ended, I was just like, this is so sad. Like her life was so sad and depressing. And even though like Whitney clearly went through so much like shit in her life, I'm sure there were moments where Whitney was happy and things were like on the up and up for her. But we never got those moments in this documentary, and it just made me really, really upset and really sad once it was over. At the end of this documentary, like there was no real celebration of Whitney's life in general. It was just sad. So that was like my biggest con of this entire documentary. So, I've done a lot of talking. Overall, I guess I would rate this documentary like a 3.5 out of 5 stars. I did really like it. I did. I genuinely did. I mean, I think that especially in the later half of Whitney Houston's career, so much coverage of the drug addiction and the relationship with Bobby Brown, watching this documentary was really refreshing, and it really humanized Whitney in so many ways. Clearly, after watching this documentary, you will learn that Whitney had so many more demons that she was dealing with aside from the drug addiction. And for me, watching this documentary put Whitney into context in a way that I just personally never thought about. Obviously, they say that if you want to be successful, you have to make many sacrifices along the way. And Whitney Houston was no exception to that rule. And this documentary showed how many sacrifices Whitney had to make in order to become really one of the biggest pop female crossover vocalists of our time. Whether it was her having to sacrifice her blackness in order to be accepted by white mainstream audiences, whether it was her having to maybe, I don't know if this is fact, but maybe potentially sacrifice her queerness, because during that time, if Whitney Houston were to say she was like a lesbian or a bisexual, like her career would have been over. Or in general, whether it was just her having to sacrifice consistently her own happiness, her own life, because she was the person that was providing the financial stability to her family and so many people around her. I just never really thought about Whitney in those contexts before, and I really appreciate that this documentary kind of has me thinking about her in so many different ways. So with all that being said, to end this really, really lengthy review, I guess to return and go back and think about the thesis of this documentary, which is Whitney Houston died of a broken heart. I guess in a way she did die of a broken heart because in a way she never really could be herself. And because of that, she sacrificed her own happiness. And I guess for me personally, I think it's so sad to think about Whitney Houston in that way. When I think about Whitney, I obviously think about the songs, and I think about the videos, and I think about the movies, and even like, you know, the funny interviews. It's sad to think that someone who has provided so many people with so much happiness and so much joy and so many memories, it's really sad to think that she couldn't find that for herself. If you're new to this channel and if this is the first video that you're watching from me ever, I'm personally a really, really huge Michael Jackson fan. I would consider myself to be a Prince fan too. And I bring Michael Jackson and Prince up obviously because, like Whitney, they were icons. And especially, you know, because they're gone, and as we get further and further and further away from the period of time when they were so popular, for me, I get very protective of them because I think their contributions to music and to entertainment and to pop culture are so huge and so important, and I respect them all in such a way that I don't think I can ever really respect any artist of my own time because they were just great. I'm kind of rambling now, but I hope that young people, or I just hope that people in general, will make the effort to go out and see this documentary if they ever get a chance to, because Whitney Houston was much more than the demons that kind of ruled her throughout her life. She was a talented person, a loving person, someone who was so full of life, and I feel like to a certain extent this documentary really showed that. So yeah, that's kind of the end of my review. Please comment down below your thoughts on this documentary if you watched it, or comment down below your thoughts on, I don't know, the legacy of Whitney Houston. She's one of my favorites, and I really want to learn more about her after watching this documentary. So just let's talk about Whitney down below. Let's celebrate Whitney Houston's life, man. Alright, I'm gonna stop talking now. If you like this video, please give this video a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button, and turn that notification button so you know when a new video from me comes out. And I will see you this Wednesday with my first ever Q&A, and I will see you on Friday with my last reaction review to The Handmaid's Tale Season 1. Alright, have a great day, night, evening, wherever you are, whenever you are watching this, and rest in peace, Whitney Houston. Bye!